You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, Sky News analysis shows a lack of investment in the power supply could be contributing to the energy bills crisis. At least 20 people are killed and tens of thousands left homeless in Madagascar as the second tropical storm in less than a fortnight strikes land. And some of the world's biggest businesses are accused of only cutting 40% of the carbon emissions they need to meet their own net zero targets. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, critics and MPs have been quick to blame the UK's ambition to cut carbon emissions to net zero for the energy supply crisis, which has seen our fuel bills soar. But analysis by our economics editor, Ed Conway, has found that a stagnation in global investment in renewable energy could be making the problem worse. So let's take a look at our data dashboard now and see the current energy supply mix. And as you can see, we've got nearly 40% of our energy coming from renewable sources today. So here's Ed.
Have net zero and environmental policy contributed to the current energy crisis?
It's clear to us all that to keep 1.5 degrees in reach, we need to consign coal to history and make clean energy our future.
That was Kwasi Kwarteng's pledge at COP26. And our energy mix is getting cleaner, but our bills are also getting bigger. Are they two related? Well, this is the typical bill once the new price cap comes in. A couple of things probably already leap out. I'll just kind of break it down so you can see the constituent parts. By far the way, the biggest part over there is wholesale costs. That's international gas prices. But there are some environmental costs as well. Within the policy costs area, about 8% of bills, so not enormous but not trivial either. But here's the thing. These are largely a consequence of the past. Renewables used to be much more expensive than other forms of power, and this is one way of looking at that. This is the energy costs over the entire lifetime of the plant, so you're talking about over decades. And a few years ago, this is how it looked back in 2009. Wind and solar, far more expensive than fossil fuels, but just look at what's happened since. By 2021, look at those bars. Wind and solar were cheaper than gas or coal. It's extraordinary, but we're still paying the price for those earlier expensive years when those bars were a lot higher. You see the point here, but it's worth just noting something else that's important. These bars are the average cost over a few decades. With fossil fuels, that's mostly, well, fuel like gas and coal for the boilers. But with renewables, the wind and the solar power are free, but most of the cost is up front. And if we look specifically at those upfront costs, just look. So same thing, we're looking specifically at just CapEx, upfront cost, and just look at how much more expensive wind and solar are. Now, both of those are valid ways of looking at kind of the same thing. But here's why this version matters. If we were really serious about net zero, you'd expect to see evidence of this in the numbers. We should be expending enormous amounts right now. But is that happening? Well, if we have a look at global spending on primary power in recent years, you can see it rose up to about 2015, so rising, rising, rising. Had it carried on at that rate, it would have kind of gone up in line with that trend. But look at what's actually happened. It's essentially stagnated. That line has basically gone flat. And for all the talk about getting to net zero, it's not obvious that governments and companies have been spending quite enough.
The government has quite high ambitions for offshore wind, 40 gigawatts by 2030, but actually we're not yet on track to get there. So we do need to be seeing greater investment in renewables over, particularly over the next 5 to 10 years.
You see, it's not quite the story you might have expected. Is net zero responsible for the current energy crisis? Well, maybe a bit. It's lifting up global demand for our gas, lifting our bills a little bit. But the real problem is we don't seem to be spending enough on energy, and that could come back to haunt us.
At least 20 people have died and tens of thousands left homeless after Cyclone struck Madagascar. Residents had barely recovered from the impact of Storm Anna less than 2 weeks before. Well, Batsirai made landfall on the country's southeast coast on Sunday near the city of Mananjari. The Category 4 cyclone brought winds of up to 103 miles per hour, which has uprooted trees and destroyed buildings in several towns and cities across the coast. Well, the worst affected areas were Mananjari, Mahanoro and Nosy Varika, with roads to the towns and cities being cut off by debris. Preliminary reports from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs suggest that over 69,000 people are currently displaced. Our Africa correspondent John Sparks has this update.
It will take weeks to make a detailed assessment of the damage done by Cyclone Batsirai, but the people of this island nation know more than most about the power and unpredictability of the climate. This Category 4 tropical storm moved over Madagascar's eastern shore on Saturday evening and left a swathe of debris and misery behind it. Search and rescue personnel are still struggling to reach some towns and villages, but preliminary reports from government officials put the death toll at 20, with some 70,000 displaced from their homes. It's the second time in 2 weeks that this nation of 30 million has been battered by a major weather system. Cyclone Anna brought heavy rains and extensive flooding to Madagascar in January and claimed the lives of 58. Batsirai has compounded the damage. With winds of 165 kilometers an hour, it shredded roofs and toppled brick walls. And residents of the coastal town of Mananjari say it has been largely destroyed. The main road linking the island's north and south has been badly damaged, but aid agencies did have some time to prepare, placing tens of thousands in emergency shelters before the storm hit. The cyclone has now left Madagascar and will dissolve its thought over the Mozambique Channel. But the people of this storm and drought-riven nation are unlikely to forget it.
And we'll be talking more about the increasing impact of extreme weather on vulnerable communities in just a few minutes in our panel discussion, so do stay with us. Now for some of the day's other climate news making headlines. And South Korea has decided to fine Mercedes-Benz for false advertising gas emissions of its diesel passenger vehicle. The Korea Fair Trade Commission said Mercedes had tampered with pollution mitigation devices by installing illegal software. The antitrust regulator says it will fine the German car maker 20.2 billion won, which is more than £12.5 million. Mercedes says it's cooperating but will not be commenting further at this time. New housing developments built on former farmland are adding hundreds of thousands of extra car journeys to England's roads. A new report has found car dependency is increasing as typical new greenfield homes are designed around a car, with it being impossible to reach essential services such as shops, schools and doctors on foot or by bike. Total rise in sea levels that would occur if all the world's glaciers melted may be 20% less than previously thought. Melting glaciers contribute around 25 to 30% of current sea level rise, but the total amount remains unclear due to a lack of ice thickness observations. Now, analysis of net zero pledges made by some of the world's biggest companies suggests that many are failing to meet their own targets. A report by the New Climate Institute finds that they're on track to cut their emissions by only 40% on average, not the 100% promised by their net zero targets. The study looked at the emission reduction targets of 25 global firms, including Amazon, Nestle, Google and Unilever. Many of the companies analysed, though, have rejected the findings and they question the report's methodology. Well, Climate Action Director at the charity Business in the Community, Gudrun Cartwright, joins us now from Westbury in Wiltshire. So welcome to you. So as we were saying, many of the companies say that the findings aren't fair. So do we have a framework by which you can compare companies' promises with their action? Is there transparency out there, Gudrun?
So I would say the main initiative is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they recently released guidance on net zero, and the British Standards Institute is currently developing a standard. But I think this is all very new, and companies are really building the bridge as they walk on it. If you think about the level of transformation we need to get to, so the UK carbon budget's calling for more than three quarters of a cut by 2035, based on 2019, it's hard to imagine what that could look like. So figuring it out and the steps to get there is really difficult. And I think one of the things that's important is that research that we did recently at Business in the Community shows that almost half of UK companies do not have a target or an action plan, and they're not seeing it as a priority to create one. So we need to look at how do we encourage more and appreciate what companies are doing, even if it's not perfect, so that we get more to step up.
And what about those companies that are making statements about going green? There are members of the public who perhaps increasingly want to make green choices themselves. So how can they make sure that a company's not just doing it because it's popular, but they're doing it because they're actually taking action?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I mean, we know our research also showed that people want companies to act, but there's a low level of awareness of what companies are actually doing. On the other side of the coin, there's a lot of reporting going on to all sorts of different initiatives and organisations. So there's clearly a gap between the reporting and the communications being easily accessible. And I think it comes round to the fact that this is a huge, challenge. It's very tricky and it's complex and it's messy. And a lot of the puzzle pieces, they're just not there yet. Companies don't know exactly how they're going to get there. So being able to communicate that well is quite hard as well. So we're recommending that companies start to involve and invite people to be part of their processes of designing and delivering, to help people understand the complexities and how you make it happen. Because we can't do it alone. No company can do it alone. It's got to be all about radical collaboration between all of us to make this happen.
Gudrun Cartwright, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, our weekly food shop can have all sorts of carbon-intensive products in it without us even knowing. In the latest of our series of climate diaries, we hear from ODA, an online grocer, which has started telling customers the environmental impact of their purchases.
The retail side is only 5% of the total emissions of groceries. 95% is in production. So to really make a difference for the climate, we had to help our customers make better choices. So we have seen the share of red meat decline after we implemented the climate receipt. Of course, this is a function both of the climate receipts, we believe, and also the general trend, but it looks promising so far. We believe that using climate recipes will be more prolific in the future. This is something that customers care about. It's also very important for the climate. If we can change how we eat, that can have a massive impact on greenhouse gas emissions.
Do stay tuned. Coming up on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by climate justice activist Days Agaji and Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, Stuart Roberts. And we're going to be discussing how consumers can best make informed climate choices. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with climate justice activist Days Agaji and Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, Stuart Roberts. So good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So first of all, corporate net zero pledges have a long way to go. That's the clear message from today's report into various companies' targets for carbon neutrality. Some big names were criticised, as we heard earlier, and they're companies that many of us buy from or interact with on a regular basis. But this is all complicated stuff. So how are we as consumers supposed to know what we're dealing with? How can we make informed choices? So, Days, this report does suggest that there are some big companies out there that aren't as green as they profess to be. The companies are saying that's unfair. So how does a consumer work out how to make a green choice if they want to when they're purchasing something?
I think we've all seen this before, where companies are saying that they care about things, but clearly they don't, because a lot of the time their ambitions are not ambitious, nor do they even follow up for them. So there is that kind of complication. But the real answer to how can we as individuals make green choices is that we can't. And that's the reality. The reality is we're in a world with very long supply chains that are unknown and are actively kept away from us. So how can we make sustainable decisions? We can't, because we don't have the information. And this is kind of why, instead of focusing on what every individual can make, I ask for collective policy decisions that can make sure that companies can actually create products that are in the lines of ethics that all of us stand behind.
Stuart, do you agree with that? As consumers, we have very little power to make green choices, and we need to rely on a framework that companies have to follow in order to make sure that their offerings are green, or at least it's transparent.
Look, I think transparency really helps us here. I think Deza talked about the complex supply chains. And as a primary producer, if you like, the first step in those supply chains, the closer I can get to the consumer, the closer consumers can understand what I do on my farm, how I'm contributing to net zero is really important. And I think too often, I think the big scandal at the moment is the whole issue of greenwashing. I'm seeing way too much of this. I'm not seeing people make the deep cuts we need to in terms of fossil fuels. And I'm not seeing many other sectors of the economy stepping up, as I know agriculture is and farmers are. And I think there's still a long way to go.
Well, yes, and Days, this report is critical of some companies. They think they're overusing this idea of carbon offsetting, perhaps planting a forest, for example, so that it allows them to pollute a little bit more. But is that such a bad thing, given there's so much deforestation and given that trees can play an important part in tackling climate change? Do you think they're right to be criticised for using that tool?
I think it's very easy to say that you'll plant a couple of trees as you continue to pollute the world that we live in. I think there should be like an active effort to stopping the harm that you're creating first and then thinking of offsetting later. And even when we start talking about tree initiatives, there's a whole grey space of if it's not properly done, it can actually cause more harm to the environment than good. Or even, for example, the delayed effect of carbon sequestering. It's not within the first, I think some people say 16 years, of a tree being planted before it can actually start sucking up carbon effectively. So these are the kind of loopholes that they're using, but this could actually lead us into a place of unknown and of uncertainty, and that's particularly quite scary.
Stuart, I've seen a lot of head nodding from you there. I mean, do you feel that farmers are affected by this? Are you seeing that some farming land is being bought up to plant trees, and is that such a bad thing?
Absolutely. And I think it is a bad thing. The wrong tree in the wrong place is the wrong thing. And for me, I am seeing many situations where land is being taken up by individuals or by corporations to greenwash their emissions. And at the same time, that process is removing family farms, people who farmed lands for generations. And land is in a limited resource. We have to use it to share food production and all the other things we want. And at the moment, I'm seeing this greenwashing actually taking away from food production, whereas we should be looking at how we do food production alongside doing our bit for climate change as well.
OK, let's move on to our next topic, shall we? Because the Indian Ocean nation of Madagascar has yet again been hit by extreme weather, this time a cyclone displacing many thousands of people. Now, we reported from the island not long ago because of a devastating drought which has affected huge sections of the population. And these disasters are happening far away from us here, but is there a message? Is this what's coming for us as the climate change problem continues? And Days, what do you make of this? I mean, obviously, it's a terrible situation for the people living there, but does news of events like that in places as far away as Madagascar move the dial here, do you think, as far as awareness of climate change is concerned?
Well, I hope it does. I think a lot of the time people forget that living in the UK, we are literally an island. We are very similar to Madagascar in certain senses, and we do have the same vulnerabilities. So there is this like question of like remembering our own situation in the world. But then also, I think the reason why a lot of people tend to not really relate the harm that's being caused in places like Madagascar to the harm that's being caused in places like Europe is because historically there's been a devaluing of life in the global south. And when this happens, this means that the natural disasters that are happening there, that if it was happening in Germany, we may have empathy for, a lot of people don't give space to that, which is an issue. We need to get to a place in society of where knowing that someone is suffering and knowing that someone is hurting is enough for us to act here, regardless of whether it feels physically close or not.
Stuart, do you agree with that?
I do. Days speaks with real authority on this, but I think also for me, let's not pretend these extreme events aren't happening on our doorstep. You know, only 2-3 months ago now, I was on farms in the north of England where we were seeing uprooted trees, we were seeing destroyed buildings, we were seeing people without power for a long time. And if anyone wants a reminder about, you know, climate change being real, impacts both at home and the disastrous impacts in places like Madagascar are a real shout for everyone, a real live call, and are precisely why every single one of us needs to do our bit to address climate change.
Well, yes, and could it make a difference amongst politicians, do you think, Days? I mean, we saw at the last COP summit in Glasgow, the vulnerable nations pushing for more money to adapt to the effects of climate change that they're already experiencing. Do you think if we see more events during the course of this year, they'll get more money when it comes to the next COP?
Well, hopefully there is money to cover the loss and damages that are being faced by these countries. But then also, I don't think that our politicians should be waiting for more chaos and hurt to happen before acting. And I think this is where we have to call on ourselves as active citizens within this democracy, and basically say enough's enough, and say we want to protect all people, all life, and we want our governments to put these policies in place. Because a lot of the time people forget that within democracy, the sovereignty and the power is held within the people. And if we say we need this, the government should be acting accordingly.
OK, well, we must leave it there. Days Agaji and Stuart Roberts, always interesting to get your thoughts. Thanks very much indeed for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it from me, but tomorrow I'll be joined by Deputy Director at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Seppi Golzari-Munro, and the journalist and author David Wallace-Wells. Do stay with us. Coming up next on The Great Debate, we're asking, can you afford the cost of living crisis? That's up next, but for me, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.